behalf of Cambridge University Press. So the talk that I'm presenting today is called Digital Pedagogy and Online Learning, Reflections and Applications for Teaching EAP. And for this talk, what I've tried to do is try to bring together maybe different ideas or different reflections and areas of work that I've done in kind of online pedagogy, digital pedagogies, and to try and, I guess, make sense of it broadly within kind of the growing body of knowledge that we have in digital pedagogies, but also within the context of the last year, I guess, where many more of us have been introduced to online and distance education than maybe we had anticipated. So the work today, I guess, builds on work that I did with Cambridge University Press, and more recently work that I've done for the Institute of Coding, which was looking at kind of how we can investigate efficacy of digital pedagogies and the challenges that we face therein. And also some work ongoing at the moment with colleagues at the University of Limerick, Dr. Elaine Reardon, looking at kind of the emotion surrounding online teaching and teaching during the pandemic as well. I should say that the Institute of Coding work I conducted also that was conducted with Dr. Iman Bushakur at Coventry University. So a lot of different ideas kind of coming into this presentation. So to start, what I want to do, I guess, is talk a little bit about the context and digital pedagogies in COVID-19, and I guess to try and identify where we're at with digital pedagogies, but also what role COVID-19 has played in maybe moving us off track or moving us on track or changing our track ever so slightly, what kind of things we're seeing there. And then to kind of move into maybe some of the research contexts in which I've worked to try and expand on this or kind of draw and learn from this. I guess in terms of these research contexts, what I've tried to do is maybe more offer reflections on this other work rather than give kind of detailed methodological investigations, because really what I want to do is highlight what we've learned from these studies, which is the kind of challenges in digital pedagogies, and also offer some kind of research-informed solutions that we might be able to address. In this kind of talk then, I guess I'm focusing a lot on some of the challenges, but it's not to say that it's all been challenging. There have been some very positive things too, and I'll try to refer to those as well. But largely I've been focusing on the challenges that we face. And then what I want to do is kind of show you some practical examples in how I go about translating this from research into practice. And in this way, I guess, thinking a lot about reflecting also on my own practices in the area of academic writing development in EAP, and how I use research to inform my practices as some kind of illustrative examples of this maybe translation. And then shortly after that, some closing remarks just to try and summarize what it is we've been looking at and kind of pull in from there. So to get started then, we're going to look a little bit at the context. And before I get started, what I would like to do is I'd like to hear a little bit from you about your own impressions of teaching through online digital pedagogies this year during the pandemic. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen onto a Menti page and present this. And what you should see is if you go to menti.com and you type this code at the top, you should get a space where you can add a couple of words. I think I gave up to 5 words. If you want more, you can refresh the page and add more again. And really what I want to do is kind of get an impression of the words you associate with digital pedagogies during the pandemic. What are your instant reactions? And this will generate a nice little word cloud for us. Thanks, Joel, for putting that in the chat. Great, we're seeing some ideas come through. International flipped online, inspirational, asynchronous engagement, creative, transformative, tiring. Yeah, okay, so really, really nice examples coming through here. And I guess maybe before having done some of this research, I might have been surprised by some of these words, but in this instance, I'm not so surprised to actually see a lot of positive words coming through. Also some negative ones there, things like frustrating, that it's tiring, challenging, etc. But also we've got other positive things coming through there, that it's exciting, inspirational, and things like that too. Innovative at the center, that's really nice to see too. I think that's exactly it. Whether it was innovation because it was a choice or it was innovation at the cost of the context, but in any event, we had to innovate in our approaches. Things like asynchronous approaches as well, but seeing things like Zoom fatigue, screen fatigue, and I think all of us can relate to that. So really exciting to see all of these kind of ideas coming through, and the kind of challenges that we may be facing during this kind of pandemic together. Lots of focus on kind of technology, lots of focus on maybe emotions, kind of things like isolated, frustration, etc. And focus on, I guess, evaluations of things like that as well. So things like surprising, that it was surprisingly, I guess, effective or ineffective, that you were surprised by the process. Things like stressful as well. So I guess a mixture here of a focus on technology, emotions, and evaluations. And that's something that we saw in the research that we conducted as well, where we looked at teacher discourses. So heartening, I guess, to see similar approaches or ideas kind of echoing through here as well. Okay, I'm going to go back to, well, I guess before I finish with this, what I want to say is, I guess bearing in mind, all of our collective experiences in the area of digital pedagogy in the last year, it's probably worth thinking about where we were at in digital pedagogy before the pandemic took place and what kind of movements were taking place, and then kind of trying to contextualize that a little bit more within the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll go back to my PowerPoint now, but thank you all for such interesting reflections. So I guess initially what we might want to know is what's digital pedagogy good for, or what do we know that it can be good for? And there's quite a few things actually that it's been seen to, I guess, support in the area of language learning, and with obvious implications for EAP. So blended context, for example, students who have a flipped approach, and that was one of the keywords that was emerging up on the screen there, often tend to do better, outperform the students who have maybe just one form of input, so whether it's online or face-to-face. So having both online and kind of blended approaches can help support student development. Interestingly, I don't know whether this is your experience or not, but often we can see a case of more participation online in online learning. And in some ways, I definitely think this reflects my own experiences, in that often, I guess as language teachers, we're all aware that there are often stronger students that are willing to answer many questions in a class, and they'll often kind of dominate unless we figure out ways to manage that. But I found that in online contexts, with the likes of that Menti tool, for example, I'm able to facilitate more and more student responses. So where I might ask a question, I might get something like 16 responses from students instead of just 2 or 3 responses from students. So in some ways, it can participate more interaction. Online pedagogy is known for supporting authenticity, so giving access to authentic engagements and texts, I guess, via the internet, and foster autonomy, and can work on this kind of idea of exploratory or ubiquitous learning, so people learn through the process of engaging in online learning through the internet. In digital pedagogies, we often see that learner's choice is really a valuable element of digital pedagogy. So we give people more choice because I guess there's more scope and often more materials in online contexts. We see different technologies being useful for different types of learning. So the likes of augmented reality can be useful for vocabulary learning because it gives us this sense of like a multi-sensory approach. We get movement, we get sound, we get color, we get lots of different ideas coming together at once, so we can layer up our meanings when we're trying to identify kind of complex words. Also, with the advances in digital technology, we see more kind of flexible and variable technology, so increases in access with mobile and bite-sized learning, so more opportunity, I guess, to engage in learning. And then we see, I guess, movements, although this perhaps is a little premature, maybe there's still a bit of time to go in the kind of development of personalized and adaptive technologies, but this idea of, you know, technologies being able to foster personalized routes through learning. And in some ways we can navigate that in online learning, but perhaps not to the kind of futuristic sense that we might like, where everything is purely automated. And also, I guess we have this sense of digital pedagogies is in online context. I guess we have this idea of immersive communities and cultures. And one thing that I guess we know is very effective for language learning is immersion, but also it's very difficult to bring into effect, because often it's for students who can afford to travel and be immersed in particular contexts. However, the likes of the internet, where people develop online and social communities, can actually create spaces for immersive communities for authentic language use and learning. So lots of positives, I think, about digital pedagogies before we kind of embarked upon the issues of the pandemic. And equally, there were lots of challenges in using technologies before, I guess, the newer challenges that emerge, and perhaps some that were strengthened by the pandemic as well. So we have this idea of the digital divide. So this is the concept that we have some students who maybe are not necessarily able to access technology in the same way, or not as digitally literate. Hockley and Dudney talk about this in contrast to the idea of the digital native as being this kind of oversimplification of the fact that just because you're born of a certain generation, you're likely to be good with technology, when in reality, it really depends on your own context, your socioeconomic context, and a range of other variables that might impact your ability to engage with online learning. You can kind of see kind of commercial conflicts in the development of technologies. And for example, Wagner and Kunin talk about this Duolingo test that was kind of commissioned by Duolingo. And so there might be commercial conflicts of interest in these ideas as well. We see kind of adaptive technologies, which we know were seen as maybe something heralded in the previous slide, are also a challenge in this context too, because we need to retrain how we engage with adaptive technologies, and otherwise you may kind of reinforce negative practices as opposed to positive ones. I think Claypole's work is really interesting in this area too, and this is something I'm really interested in, I guess, as we move forward with digital pedagogies, is the overlap between UX, user experience, and online delivery systems and language pedagogies, and how, I guess, as users of technologies, we're primed to be able to navigate technologies in certain ways, and how we reconcile those processes with the likes of pedagogies, I guess, that we believe are effective for facilitating learning. So these are some of the challenges. Sharkey talks about the idea of using robots in the classroom, which sounds, I guess, quite futuristic, but really, I guess, in this sense, we're talking about technology that responds to students in some authentic way. So it could be like a chatbot type thing. However, I guess they kind of cautioned the idea of creating these kind of humanized interactions where students might be sharing information or kind of even you know, growing attached to or getting comfortable with things that aren't in fact real. So a lot of different challenges, I think, in the way that we approach digital pedagogies, as well as a lot of advantages to using it. And I think probably at the core of all of these issues is, I think this quote by Selwyn is quite nice, and it pulls together what I think are kind of the critical ideas that we need to contend with when we work in digital pedagogies, which is that digital pedagogies will not automatically support and enhance the learning process unless some thought is given to the goodness of the fit between the learning task and the learning technology. And so I guess what this means is that we've got certain advantages of technology and we've got certain challenges in technology, but I guess that kind of binary of what it's good at or bad at might be problematic, when in fact it's a lot more to do with how we use it to achieve learning aims and how it facilitates learning aims, but also how our learning can facilitate more effective technology use as well, and digital literacy. So how do these things work together? And I guess these were probably some of the ideas that we were in this area, we were all working with to try and unpack challenges in digital pedagogies. And then as the COVID-19 pandemic unfolded, with more and more people moving online in this kind of mass transition to online education, what we found was that there were, I guess, more challenges or compounded challenges that were taking place as we moved online. So, oh, actually, I should say before we move on to that in the context of academic writing, for example, which is an area that I'm interested in, I spoke about this in another talk that is recorded and available online through BALEAP, the BALEAP site, that there are lots of different ways in which academic writing or writing for EAP, for example, can be facilitated by technologies. And this has implications for things like feedback in writing, with feedback in technology, looking at corpora for technology and different kind of corpus-informed tools for technology and feedback. Technology has been seen to be able to support the writing process through drafting. It's been able to support consolidating learning through kind of writing technologies and learning through writing. Things like spell checkers and punctuation checkers are effective for being able to deal with these kind of lexical issues, or not lexical, these kind of sentential issues in writing. And also what was quite interesting, and it goes back to some of the questions of what digital pedagogies are effective at more generally, is that it's been seen to offer kind of affective supports for students. And so this is the idea that students are happy to be able to write in safe spaces where they aren't necessarily having to deliver their work to their teachers and have that be examined in detail until they're ready, so they can kind of work on it themselves in safer spaces. And so digital pedagogies and academic writing, I think, is something that we can kind of see a lot of scope for development as well. And in the areas of things like learner engagement and motivation, lots of things to talk about there too, that technology can really facilitate motivation. And that was something that we found in the study I did with my colleague Elaine Reardon on Write and Improve, and that's what the basis of the other talk, so that's recorded and online, that we found that motivation was really, really heavily supported by the use of this tool. And so I think with this kind of idea, there were lots of ways in which we could try and look at digital pedagogies in online teaching, look at the implication for particular areas of language pedagogy like writing, and identify what it could do and what it maybe is not so effective at facilitating. But as I said, with the kind of transition to the COVID-19 pandemic, there kind of other issues were emerged or were compounded over the course of the last year or so. And I think these really shouldn't be understated, that the COVID-19 in education has exacerbated issues of inequity and justice, and in the context of education, we're seeing this too. So for example, there's a clear decimation of the youth employment sector, and so student jobs have gone, which means that there's a more precarity in students' lives for their studies, and that is likely to impact their practices in education. We're seeing a rise in student mental health issues. So obviously that's going to negatively impact the way in which we engage with, our students engage with online learning as well. And in the EDGE report here, I think the EDGE Foundation, they found that better off households are spending 30% more time each day on educational activities than those from the poorest fifth household. So there's a clear financial imbalance here as well. And in this report, they talk a lot about the idea of widening access to private and online education to be able to kind of, address issues in the attainment gap, and that students from kind of poor backgrounds and those from better off backgrounds rather were able to kind of engage in education more effectively during this period. So I think that, the COVID-19 pandemic has so many implications socially in terms of equity and justice, that these are kind of underpinning issues that are likely guiding the ways in which our students are engaging in education. And particularly in the higher education sector, I guess what they're seeing is that while there are a lot of challenges in the ways in which we engage with online learning over this last year, that there are also maybe things that are developing for the better. And so that's something that we're going to have to reconsider as we move forward, which elements of our education we can keep. And I think this reflects a lot of what you were already sharing in that word cloud, that while there were a lot of challenges, there were also a lot of things there about innovation, about inspiring, about things being good. So I guess we want to try and disentangle the practices that can support the use of digital pedagogies in these contexts and those that may impede it. So in the context of international education, and I think that's something that we're all interested in, we have a clear impact on things like international student mobility. And so this brings us back to the idea of students studying from a distance. I don't know about all of you, but I have, in this last term, for example, I've had students who normally, I guess, would be in the UK who are actually who are based all over the world in this last term because they couldn't necessarily travel. And so that was a real challenge in trying to navigate how to create spaces for learning that were synchronous and asynchronous, that could be adopted by students in different ways, depending on where they are. For example, at some points in the day when I would have lessons that students from China were attending, it would be 1 a.m. in the morning for them. So not an enjoyable way for them to have to study in such a complicated time as well. So a lot of issues, I guess, in online learning and mobility. And to reconcile the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic with the kind of practices that have emerged in the way in which we teach and use online learning to facilitate teaching, I think that this paper by Adedoyin and Soikan is of note. I really liked this paper that talked about the idea of crisis pedagogies. And so they talked about this crisis response migration methods that were adopted by universities. They're limited to delivery media and without taking cognizance of effective online education theories and models. So basically they're saying that in a lot of contexts where we had to move online, we had to do it really quickly. We weren't necessarily able to build complex infrastructure for being able to deliver online pedagogies. And so they said that this crisis response migration due to the pandemic should not be equated with effective online education or digital transformation of universities, but be seen from the perspective of emergency remote teaching. And so I found that quite comforting, actually, because I thought, well, this is a very honest and I think accurate reflection of the challenges that we faced over the last year, and that I think in many ways we're evolving into still, that we're trying to figure out best practices or the ways in which we can engage with online pedagogies to support our learning going forward. And I guess moving from the kind of earlier work on digital pedagogy about what's effective and what's ineffective, and looking also at the context of the pandemic and how it's maybe evolving our approach to digital pedagogies, what I wanted to do was pull together ideas from a range of different projects on which I've worked to try and make sense of digital pedagogies over the last year and think about what advice we could give to practitioners who are working in this context to be able to develop their pedagogies going forward. And so in so doing, what I wanted to draw on were a number of studies such as those that I mentioned previously. And effectively what I wanted to do was I wanted to think about the challenges that we face in online teaching. I wanted to think about how the pandemic has impacted teacher practices. And I wanted to think a little bit about what we can extract from these wider themes to inform our practices in the context of EAP. So in many ways, this is where my kind of reflections come in, where I try to pull together these interesting topics and try and relate them to practice in this very specific context of English for academic purposes. So what were the key themes and challenges? A number of themes emerged in the kind of in the projects that I undertook. In the first project, what I did was I looked at, with my colleague, Dr. Iman Bushkur, I looked at a range of courses and course evaluations in order to be able to kind of identify emerging themes as to what was effective or ineffective in digital pedagogies through the Institute of Coding. And so in this report, what we looked at were trying to kind of thematically code these evaluations in order to be able to identify these key themes and reconcile these key themes with the wider literature. And so we saw themes emerge like challenges related to engagement, motivation, and socialized learning. And we saw challenges regarding issues like flexible and adaptive learning. We saw challenges related to digital literacies, to goal setting, to feedback use, and all of these kind of coming together in I guess a range of ways in which the pandemic or movement to online distance learning entirely might have been challenging. So for example, in the context of engagement, motivation, and socialized learning, looking for ways in which we can get students to create the sense of a collaborative, community-driven approach to online education. I don't know, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear your own experiences about it, and feel free to share this in the chat, because I would be interested to see as to, you know, whether or not this is some feedback that you've received from students surrounding the idea of creating online communities and spaces for learning in the last year. It's definitely conversations I've had with my students where we're trying to figure out the best ways in which we might be able to facilitate this idea of kind of communities of practice effectively in our classes through our online platforms. In the online context, I guess, looking at ways in which we might be able to facilitate flexible and adaptive learning. I think the ideas surrounding flexible and adaptive learning were often that it felt more complex, but in reality, I don't think it necessarily needs to be so complex to be able to facilitate flexible and adaptive learning. Rather, it needs to, I think it kind of fits under this idea of choice and giving learners opportunities to be able to make choices about what it is they're doing in their learning. In the context of digital literacies, this was, I guess, for both practitioners, teachers, and learners. So looking at how we could facilitate digital literacies in kind of a cumulative sense, because we've had to make this transition quite quickly, and how can we continue to develop digital literacies in this area? The kind of engagement between goal setting and online learning was evident. So giving students space to be able to make goals, and actually in some ways online learning might be able to facilitate this quite effectively, because it is quite good for being able to document goals and being able to look back at your goals in some way. And also knowing how to engage with feedback in online contexts, and knowing how to facilitate that for students. So this comes, I guess, to an area of assessment literacy, not necessarily just feedback, so how do students manage that. And in the context of the teacher discourses that we looked at, we found really interesting things emerge that I guess reflect some of the main points that that you had mentioned in the word cloud as well. And so this would be things like a focus on online learning supports. So looking at the idea that teachers were trying to share supports with one another for teaching in online contexts. There was a clear need to share and help one another in terms of being able to create this sense of an online community. There were overwhelmingly positive emotions, and at first I was quite surprised by this, but then again today I think a lot of the emotions that were expressed in that word cloud were positive. There were negative emotions in there too, though. So a balance of emotions, but a lot of positive emotions were kind of expressed in this study. I should say that for this study, what we looked at is kind of discourses of TESOL practitioners and organizations in online contexts to be able to see how they're discussing the impact of the pandemic on their work. And this formed a corpus that we then analyzed. So that was the idea behind the positive emotions there. And there was a focus on, as you might guess, technologies, digital literacies, and also this idea of distance and proximity. So there was an idea surrounding remote teaching, distance learning, things like this. And so these were the kind of clear considerations that the teachers had, and the kind of things that they felt were worth discussing. And so I think if we try to align some of these challenges that were faced by teachers, or that they discussed, and we align some of these kind of key themes that emerge from reviews of online courses and online programs, we can kind of arrive at a number of criteria that might be useful to help us to kind of consider our own development in some way. And of course, the list is so expansive. In the report for this study that I prepared with Dr. Iman Bushkur, that will have quite an extended list of guidelines and ideas. It would be too much to kind of go into here. So I've kind of picked out a few of them to kind of illustrate some of the key themes and practices that emerged. So for that, we can think about how these key themes and practices might inform our practices in the area of online teaching. So if we were to focus on things like digital literacies emerged in both the kind of, reviews of courses as well as discourses, teacher discourses. And the challenges often in the teacher discourses were to do with their own digital literacies, their ability to use technologies in online teaching. And so finding ways to be able to support the digital literacy development in kind of a cumulative sense. And that, I guess, this idea that professional development and continued professional development doesn't necessarily need to be, centered around very specific occasions like conferences or training days, etc. But it can be something that's ongoing if we embed within our practices a general reflective practice for being able to identify areas of challenge in our practices and ways in which we can move forward. And digital literacies was a clear area for development that emerged. There was also this idea of digital assessment for learning. And so this was looking at supporting students in figuring out how they might be able to navigate digital assessments. How would they be able to process the kind of online context and being able to understand the feedback that they were receiving as well. So in a sense, an area again of assessment literacy and digital literacy combined. Themes like adaptive and flexible learning emerge. So this is the idea of being able to facilitate adaptive and flexible learning in our online teaching, and creating kind of positive or engaging learning, and also learner-centered learning. And again, this is something that that emerged in the review of courses. And the last kind of theme there, interactive, socialized, and collaborative learning. So creating a space for collaborative learning in our online contexts. So a lot of different themes, I guess, to emerge there. And I guess what I kind of thought of with these ideas was that these could serve to foster a number of criteria that we could use to kind of check or evaluate our particular practices in online pedagogies. So if we think about translating this to online EAP writing development, we might think about digital literacies in terms of technologies for writing. So working on things like corpus tools or spell checks, for example. So the Ball Quick Links project by Vincent and Nessie, I think, is of note here, looking at how we might be able to foster awareness of these kind of technologies in learners. And this effectively just means raising their awareness of how to use these technologies themselves. Like I said, for digital assessment for learning, this could be things like write and improve. So in the other project that I talked about, we looked at how students are informed as to how they might be able to navigate these technologies, what kinds of feedback they get, and how they interpret that feedback. And those kind of blocks, which are really more procedural than anything, would impede the overall efficacy of the tool for online learning. So again, this idea of adaptive learning and flexible learning, I think, can really be underpinned by creating opportunities for choice in tasks. And for example, often what I do when I'm making asynchronous tasks for my learners is I will create more tasks than there are people and get them to choose one in particular that they want to do. So that way they can all work on something slightly different and have another element of their work that maybe feels a bit more personalized. Or also creating space for multimodality. So for academic writing in my context, for example, facilitating blog writing, because blog writing effectively makes use of digital technologies. And you can incorporate into that multimodal elements that really transform writing from what we might initially perceive of it to be. Things like positive, engaging, and learner-centered learning. So again, areas like data-driven learning and corpus linguistics can be really effective for this. Learner text choice, again, can be really effective for this. And also embedding explicit metacognitive strategy development into learning. So things like goal setting and regulation, self-regulation. So being able to get learners to become a bit more independent. And then the last space there was collaborative kind of learning, interactive learning. So using kind of collaborative writing techniques with Google Docs, and that's worked quite well for me. Also creating student study groups, online study groups for students to be able to work together, and also giving students respondents to particular online tasks. So we can foster this idea of them responding to posts online. And also getting my students to explicitly reflect on community development. I think one thing that kind of underpinned all of this, or rather underpins still, is the sense of developing learner autonomy. And for me, I think that's probably what is really at the core of digital pedagogies at the moment, is this idea of this distance that there is between us and our learners. And sometimes it isn't as easy for us to be able to support them in the ways that we might like to, if we were able to do it face to face. But what we can do is we can try and foster their development as learners so that they might be able to support themselves better. So I guess to kind of show this applied very briefly, thinking about the context of EAP, here's a lesson plan that I developed for critical writing in EAP. So this is looking at how we might develop critical writing in English for Academic Purposes classroom. And basically this lesson plan, I can make this available afterwards. It's online on the World of Better Learning website. The idea here is to use software like Menti to kind of crowdsource ideas. So you can, like the one that I did at the beginning, where you can get everybody involved and create this quite engaging presentation of ideas that emerge. Using the likes of breakout rooms to facilitate engagement, and also quite safe spaces for discussing the prompts that we give, where we give students prompts to be able to identify their own sense of what it means to write critically. We could use things like voting software to help visualize the learners voting, and then this can also help refocus the tasks that we're giving, which is to get students to choose particular areas of critical writing that they need to develop in their own writing. And then what we can do is we can get learners to write a text, and writing a text using the kind of area that they really need to develop. And then we can use draft writing software to be able to kind of develop a writing process, as well as the focus of the area of critical writing that we want to develop. And then also at the very end, step 5 is this idea of creating a reflective task. So getting learners to reflect on their overall development in developing critical writing, academic writing. And so if we think about this in relation to the above themes that I've mentioned, this is looking at things like, in the first instance, getting students to, or using Menti rather, the crowdsource ideas, gives us an opportunity to develop our own digital literacies and students' digital literacies. We can use breakout rooms to facilitate socializing collaborative learning. We can use these voting tools again for developing further literacies. In terms of getting students to write, we can encourage them to write using particular technologies, for example, and this will facilitate the development of digital assessment literacy for redrafting, but also giving them flexible approaches so they can choose a particular text that they'd like to work on. And then getting them to reflect on their own development with very explicit guidance gives them this learner-centered approach. And so we can embed these kind of pedagogical ideas within our own practices. I guess as a final kind of word of caution before I finish is that while I was thinking about this talk, a lot of it I felt when we talk about digital pedagogies, we think about them almost as technology and pedagogy as a binary. And I did too in my initial work in this area. I thought of things like putting the pedagogy first, which is something that I've spoken about before. But then I saw this really interesting paper from Tsui and Tavares that talked about the technology cart and the pedagogy horse. Effectively what they do is they caution this kind of simplified dichotomy that we should put the pedagogy first and the technology second, and rather see it as a more complex system or a more synergetic system where they complement one another or they shape one another. And I think this is a really interesting idea, and probably leaves us open to using technology in ways that that can both support our teaching and also guide it in some ways. And that openness, I guess, is something as teachers we're always keen to kind of facilitate. So I think this is an interesting area to kind of unpack further. And I wanted to kind of share this here because it struck me when I read this paper. So to conclude, I think the main points here that I wanted to kind of pull together was assessing what it is that we know about digital pedagogies, you know, outside of this particular climate in which we've all been using them probably a bit more actively. Recognizing the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the role of crisis pedagogies on digital pedagogies. Consider maybe the challenges that both professional and personal challenges that have arrived during this COVID-19 pandemic that could impact our online teaching. And then think a little bit about how that might affect our online teaching of EAP. And so here what I wanted to do was take a broad perspective, drawing on online education more generally, and then indigenize it to the context of EAP. And I guess the kind of the core closing message is this idea of oversimplification and putting the cart before the horse. So kind of remaining open to the relationship between technology and pedagogy as this maybe more synergetic relationship than maybe we initially considered. So thank you all for coming along to my talk. I hope you found that interesting. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them.